The Memoirs of Colonel John S. Mosby. I was born December 6, 1833, at the home of my grandfather, James McLaurin, in Powhatan County, Virginia. He was a son of Robert McLaurin, an Episcopal minister who came from Scotland before the Revolution. Great-grandfather McLaurin lived at the glebe and is buried at Peterville Church in Powhatan. After the church was disestablished, the state appropriated the glebe, and Peterville was sold to the Baptists. My grandfather McLaurin lived to be very old. He was a soldier of the Revolution, and I well remember his cough, which it was said he contracted from exposure in the war when he had smallpox. My grandfather Mosby was also a native of Powhatan. He lived at Gibraltar, but moved to Nelson County, where my father, Alfred D. Mosby, was born. When I was a child, my father bought a farm near Charlottesville, in Albemarle, on which I was raised. I recollect that one day I went with my father to our peach orchard on a high ridge, and he pointed out Monticello, the home of Thomas Jefferson, on a mountain a few miles away, and told me some of the history of the great man who wrote the Declaration of Independence. At that time, there were no public and few private schools in Virginia, but a widow opened a school in Fry's Woods, adjoining my father's farm. My sister Victoria and I went as her pupils. I was 7 years old when I learned to read, although I had gone a month or so to a country school in Nelson, near a post office called Merle's Shop, where I had learned to spell. As I was so young, my mother always sent a Negro boy with me to the schoolhouse, and he came for me in the evening. But once I begged him to stay all day with me, and I shared my dinner with him. When playtime came, some of the larger boys put him up on a block for sale, and he was knocked down to the highest bidder. I thought it was a bona fide sale, and was greatly distressed at losing such a dutiful playmate. We went home together, but he never spent another day with me at the schoolhouse. The first drunken man I ever saw was my schoolmaster. He went home at playtime to get his dinner, but took an overdose of whiskey. On the way back, he fell on the roadside and went to sleep. The big boys picked him up and carried him into the schoolhouse, and he heard our lessons. The school closed soon after. I don't know why. It was a common thing in the old days of Negro slavery for a Virginia gentleman who had inherited a fortune to live in luxury with plenty of the comforts of life and die insolvent, while his overseer retired to live on what he had saved. Mr. Jefferson was one example of this. I often heard that Jefferson had held in his arms Betsy Wheat, a pupil at the school where I learned to read. She was the daughter of the overseer and, being the senior of all the other scholars, was the second in command. She exercised as much authority as the schoolmistress. As I've said, the log schoolhouse was in Fry's Woods, which adjoined my father's farm. To this rude hut I walked daily for 3 sessions with my eldest sister, later with 2, often through a deep snow, to get the rudiments of an education. I remember that the schoolmistress, a most excellent woman, whipped her son and me for fighting. That was the only blow I ever received during the time I went to school. A few years ago, I visited the spot in company with Bartlett Bolling, who was with me in the war. There was nothing left but a pile of rocks, the remains of the chimney. The associations of the place raised up phantoms of the past. I am the only survivor of the children who went to school there. I went to the spring along the same path where I had often walked when a barefooted schoolboy and got a drink of cool water from a gourd. There I first realized the pathos of the once popular air, Ben Bolt. The spring was still there and the running brook, but all of my schoolmates had gone. The Peter Parley were the standard school books of my day. In my books were 2 pictures that made a lasting impression on me. One was of Wolfe dying on the field in the arms of a soldier. The other was of Putnam riding down the stone steps with the British close behind him. About that time, I borrowed a copy of The Life of Marion, which was the first book I read, except as a task at school. I remember how I shouted when I read aloud in the nursery of the way the great partisan hid in the swamp and outwitted the British. I did not then expect that the time would ever come when I would have escapes as narrow as that of Putnam, and take part in adventures that have been compared with Marion's. When I was 10 years old, I began going to school in Charlottesville. Sometimes I went on horseback, and sometimes I walked. Two of my teachers, James White, who taught Latin and Greek, and Alec Nelson, who taught mathematics, were afterwards professors at Washington and Lee, while General Robert E. Lee was its president. When I was 16 years old, I went as a student to the University of Virginia, some evidence of the progress I had made in getting an education. In my youth, I was very delicate and often heard that I would never live to be a grown man. But the prophets were wrong, for I have outlived nearly all the contemporaries of my youth. I was devoted to hunting, and a servant always had coffee ready for me at daylight on a Saturday morning, so that I was out shooting when nearly all were sleeping. My father was a slaveholder, and I still cherish a strong affection for the slaves who nursed me and played with me in my childhood. That was the prevailing sentiment in the South, not one peculiar to myself, but one prevailing in all the South toward an institution which we now thank Abraham Lincoln for abolishing. I had no taste for athletics and have never seen a ball game. My habits of study were never regular, but I always had a literary taste. While I fairly recited Tacitus and Thucydides as a task, I read with delight Irving's stories of the Moors in Granada. Chapter 2. The War Begins. I went to Bristol, Virginia in October 1855 and opened a law office. I was a stranger and the first lawyer that located there. When attending court at Abingdon in the summer of 1860, I met William Blackford, who had been in class with me at the university and who was afterwards a colonel of engineers on General Stuart's staff. Blackford asked me to join a cavalry company which he was assisting to raise, and in which he expected to be a lieutenant. To oblige him, I allowed my name to be put on the muster roll, but was so indifferent about the matter that I was not present when the company organized. William E. Jones was made captain. He was a graduate of West Point and had resigned from the United States Army a few years before. Jones was a fine soldier, but his temper produced friction with his superiors and greatly impaired his capacity as a commander. There were omens of war at this time, but nobody realized the impending danger. Our first drill was on January Court Day, 1861. I borrowed a horse and rode up to Abingdon to take my first lesson. After the drill was over and the company had broken ranks, I went to hear John B. Floyd make a speech on the condition of the times. He had been Secretary of War and had lately resigned. Buchanan, in the history of his administration, said that Floyd's resignation had nothing to do with secession, but he requested it on account of financial irregularities he had discovered in the War Department. But to return to the campaign of 1860. I never had any talent or taste for stump speaking or handling party machines, but with my strong convictions I was a supporter of Douglas I and the Union. Whenever a Whig became extreme on the slave question, he went over to the opposition party. No doubt the majority of the Virginia Democrats agreed with the Union sentiments of Andrew Jackson, but the party was controlled by a section known as the Chivalry, who were disciples of Calhoun and got most of the honors. It was for this reason that a Virginia senator, Mason, who belonged to that school, was selected to read to the Senate the dying speech of the great apostle of secession and slavery, Calhoun. It proved to be a legacy of woe to the South. I met Mr. Mason at an entertainment given him on his return from London after the close of the war. He still bore himself with pride and dignity, but without that hauteur which is said to have characterized him when he declared in the Senate that he was an ambassador from Virginia. He found his home in the Shenandoah Valley desolate. It will be remembered that, with John Slidell, Mason was captured when a passenger on board an English steamer and sent a prisoner to Fort Warren in Boston Harbor, but he was released on demand of the English government. Mason told us many interesting things about his trip to London, of a conversation with Lord Brougham at a dinner, and the mistake the London post office had made in sending his mail to the American minister, Charles Francis Adams, and Mr. Adams's mail to Mason. Seeing him thus in the wreck of his hopes, and with no future to cheer him, I was reminded of Caius Marius brooding among the ruins of Carthage. William L. Yancey of Alabama did more than any other man in the South to precipitate the sectional conflict. In a commercial convention, shortly before the campaign of 1860, he had offered resolutions in favor of repealing the laws against the African slave trade. Yancey attacked Thomas Jefferson as an abolitionist, as Calhoun had done in the Senate, and called Virginia a breeding ground for slaves to sell to the cotton states. He also charged her people with using the laws against the importation of Africans to create for themselves a monopoly in the slave market. Roger A. Pryor replied to him in a powerful speech. Yancey was more responsible than any other man for the disruption of the Democratic Party and consequently of the Union. He came to Virginia to speak in the presidential canvass. I was attending court at Abingdon, where Yancey was advertised to speak. A few Douglas men in the county had invited Tim Rives, a famous stump orator, to meet Yancey, and I was delegated to call on the latter and prepare a joint debate. Yancey was stopping at the house of Governor Floyd, then Secretary of War. I went to Floyd's home, was introduced to Yancey, and stated my business. He refused the joint debate, and I shall never forget the arrogance and contempt with which he treated me. I heard his speech that day. It was a strong one for his side. As the Virginia people had not yet been educated up to the secession point, Yancey thinly veiled his disunion purposes. That night, we put up Tim Rives, who made a great speech in reply to Yancey and pictured the horrors of disunion and war. Rives was elected a member of the convention that met the next winter, and there voted against disunion. Early in the war, the company in which I was a private was in camp near Richmond, and one day I met Rives on the street. It was the first time I had seen him since the speech at Abingdon. I had written an account of his speech for a Richmond paper, which pleased him very much, and he was very cordial. He wanted me to go with him to the governor's house and get Governor Letcher, who had also been a Douglas man the year before, to give me a commission. I declined and told him that as I had no military training, I preferred serving as a private under a good officer. I had no idea then that I should ever rise above the ranks. A few days before the presidential election, I was walking on the street in Bristol when I was attracted by a crowd that was holding a Bell and Everett meeting. Someone called on me to make a Union speech. I rose and told the meeting that I saw no reason for making a Union speech at a Bell and Everett meeting, that it was my mission to call not the righteous, but sinners to repentance. This brought down the house. I little thought that in a few months I should be regarded as one of the sinners. I was very friendly with the editor of the Secession paper in my town. One day he asked me what I intended to do in the case of a collision between the government and South Carolina. I told him I would be on the side of the Union. He said that I should find him on the other side. "Very well," I replied. "I shall meet you at Philippi." Some years after the war, he called upon me in Washington and jokingly reminded me of what I had said to him. As he was about my age and did not go into the army, I was tempted to tell him that I did go to Philippi, but did not meet him there. In April 1861 came the call to arms. On the day after the bombardment by South Carolina and the surrender of Fort Sumter that aroused all the slumbering passions of the country, I was again attending court at Abingdon when the telegraph operator told me of the great news that had just gone over the wire. Mr. Lincoln had called on the states for troops to suppress the rebellion. In the preceding December, Floyd had ordered Major Anderson to hold Sumter against the secessionists to the last extremity. Anderson simply obeyed Floyd's orders. When the news came, Governor Floyd was at home, and I went to his house to tell him. I remember he said it would be the bloodiest war the world had ever seen. Floyd's was a sad fate. He had, as Secretary of War, given great offense to the North by the shipping of arms from the northern arsenals to the South, some months before secession. He was charged with having been in collusion with the enemies of the government under which he held office and with treachery. At Donelson, He was the senior officer in command. When that other brigadiers refused to fight any longer, he brought off his own men and left the others to surrender to Grant. This was regarded as a breach of discipline, and Jefferson Davis relieved him of his command. When Lincoln's proclamation was issued, the Virginia Convention was still in session and had not passed a secession ordinance, so she was not included with states against which the proclamation was first directed. With the exception of the northwestern section of the state, where there were few slaves and the Union sentiment predominated, the people of Virginia, in response to the president's call for troops to enforce the laws, sprang to arms to resist the government. The war cry, "To arms," resounded throughout the land, and in the delirium of the hour, we all forgot our Union principles in our sympathy with the pro-slavery cause and rushed to the field of Mars. In issuing his proclamation, Lincoln referred for authority to a statute in pursuance of which George Washington sent an army into Pennsylvania to suppress the whiskey insurrection. But the people were persuaded that Lincoln's real object was to abolish slavery, although at his inaugural he had said, "There has never been any reasonable cause for such apprehension that by the accession of the Republican administration, their property and their peace and personal security were endangered. Indeed, the most ample evidence to the contrary has all the while existed and been open to their inspection. It is found in nearly all the published speeches of him who now addresses you. I do but quote from one of those speeches when I declare that I have no purpose, directly or indirectly, to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. The South had always been solid for slavery, and when the quarrel about it resulted in a conflict of arms, those who had approved the policy of disunion took the pro-slavery side. It was perfectly logical to fight for slavery if it was right to own slaves. Enforcing the laws was not coercing a state unless the state resisted the execution of the laws. When such a collision came, coercion depended on which was the stronger side. The Virginia Convention had been in session about 2 months, but a majority had opposed secession up to the time of the proclamation, and even then a large minority, including many of the ablest men in Virginia, voted against it. Among that number was Jubal Early, who was prominent in the war. Nobody cared whether it was a constitutional right they were exercising or an act of revolution. At such times, reason is silent and passion prevails. The Ordinance of Secession was adopted in April and provided that it be submitted to a popular vote on the 4th Thursday in May. According to the state's rights theory, Virginia was still in the Union until the ordinance was ratified, but the state immediately became an armed camp, and her troops seized the United States Armory at Harper's Ferry and the Norfolk Navy Yard. Virginia went out of the Union by force of arms, and I went with her. Chapter 3. A Private in the Cavalry. In that fateful April 1861, our local company, with other companies of infantry and cavalry, went into camp in a half-finished building of the Martha Washington College in the suburbs of Abingdon. Captain Jones allowed me to remain in Bristol for some time to close up the business I had in hand for clients and to provide for my family. A good many owed me fees when I left home, and they still owe me. My last appearance in court was at Blountville, Tennessee, before the Chancellor. My first night in camp, I was detailed as one of the camp guards. Sergeant Tom Edmondson, a gallant soldier who was killed in June 1864, gave me the countersign and instructed me as to the duties of a sentinel. For 2 hours in a cold wind, I walked my round and was very glad when my relief came and I could go to rest on my pallet of straw. The experience of my first night in camp rather tended to chill my military ardor, and was far more distasteful than picketing near the enemy's lines on the Potomac, which I afterwards did in hot and cold weather, very cheerfully. In fact, I enjoyed it. The danger of being shot by a rifleman in a thicket, if not attractive, at least kept a vedette awake and watching. At this time I was the frailest and most delicate man in the company, but camp duty was always irksome to me, and I preferred being on the outposts. During the whole time that I served as a private, nearly a year, I only once missed going on picket 3 times a week. The single exception was when I was disabled one night by my horse falling over a cow lying in the road. Captain Jones had strict ideas of discipline, which he enforced, but he took good care of his horses as well as his men. There was a horse inspection every morning, and the man whose horse was not well groomed got a scolding mixed with some cursing by Captain Jones. Jones was always very kind to me. He drilled his own company and also a company of cavalry from Marion, which had come to our camp to get the benefit of his instruction in cavalry tactics. In the Marion Company was William E. Peters, professor at Emory and Henry College, who had graduated in the same class in Greek with me at the university. When he and I were students reading Thucydides, we did not expect ever to take part in a greater war than the Peloponnesian. Peters had left his literary work to be a lieutenant of cavalry. He was made a staff officer by General Floyd in his campaign that year in West Virginia. For some reason, Peters was not with Floyd when the latter escaped from Fort Donelson in February 1862. Peters was a strict churchman, but considered it his duty to fight a duel with a Confederate officer. He became a colonel of cavalry. Peters's regiment was with McCausland when he was sent by General Early in August 1864 to Chambersburg, and his regiment was selected as the one to set fire to the town. Peters refused to obey the order, for which he is entitled to a monument to his memory. Reprisals in war can only be justified as a deterrent. As the Confederates were holding the place for only a few hours, while the Northern armies were occupying a large part of the South, no doubt, aside from any question of humanity, Peters thought it was bad policy to provoke retaliation. General Early ordered a reprisal in kind on account of the houses burned in the Shenandoah Valley a few months before by General Hunter. As General Early made no mention of Peters in his book, I imagine it was because of his refusal to apply the torch to Chambersburg. On his return from this expedition, McCausland was surprised by Averell at Moorfield, and Peters was wounded and captured. He told me that he had expected to be put under arrest for disobedience as soon as he got back to Virginia. Hunter was a member of an old Virginia family, but he showed no favor to Virginians. At Bull Run, he commanded the leading division that crossed at Sudley and was badly wounded, but there was no sympathy for him in Virginia. A relative of his told me that when Hunter met a lady who was a near relative, he offered to embrace her but was repelled. She thought that in fighting against Virginia, he was committing an unnatural act, and that he had the feelings described by Hamlet of one who would kill a king and marry with his brother. On Hunter's staff was his relative Colonel Strother, who had won literary distinction over the pen name of Port Crayon. Both men seemed to be animated by the same sentiments towards their kin. Hunter presided over the court that condemned Mrs. Surratt as an accessory to the assassination of President Lincoln. He closed his life by suicide. But to return to our company of cavalry and my first days as a soldier. We were sent within a few days to another camping ground where we had plank sheds for shelter and where we drilled regularly. Several companies of infantry shared the camp with us. Once I had been detailed for camp guard and, having been relieved just as the company went out to drill, I saddled my horse and went along. I had no idea that it was a breach of discipline to be doing double duty until 2 men with muskets came up and told me that I was under arrest for it. I was too proud to say a word, and, as my time had come, I went again to walking my rounds. Once after that, when we were in camp on Bull Run, I was talking at night with the colonel in his tent and did not hear the bugle sounded for roll call. So a lieutenant, who happened to be in command, ordered me, as a penalty, to do duty the rest of the morning as a camp guard. He knew that my absence from roll call was not willful, but a mistake. I would not make any explanation, but served my tour of duty. These were the only instances in which I was punished when a private. Our circuit judge, Fulkerson, who had served in the Mexican War, was appointed a colonel by Governor Letcher, and took command of the camp at Abingdon. But in a few days we were ordered to Richmond. Fulkerson, with the infantry, went by rail, but Jones preferred to march his company all the way. As he had been an officer in the army on the plains, we learned a good deal from him in the 2 weeks on the road, and it was a good course of discipline for us. I was almost a perfect stranger in the company to which I belonged, and I felt so lonely in camp that I applied to Captain Jones for a transfer to an infantry company from Bristol. He said that I would have to get the approval of the governor and forwarded my application to him at Richmond. Fortunately, the next day we were ordered away, and I heard nothing more about the transfer. On May 30th, in the afternoon, our company, 100 strong, left Abingdon to join the army. In spite of a drizzling rain, the whole population was out to say farewell. In fact, a good many old men rode several miles with us. We marched 10 miles and then disbanded to disperse in squads under the command of an officer or of a non-commissioned officer to spend the night at the country homes. I went under Jim King, the orderly sergeant, and spent the night at the house of Major Beatty, who gave us the best of everything, but I was so depressed at parting with my wife and children that I scarcely spoke a word. King had been a cadet at West Point for a short time and had learned something of tactics. He was afterwards transferred to the 37th Virginia Infantry and was killed in Jackson's battle at Kernstown. When the roll was called the next morning at the rendezvous at Old Glade Spring Church, I don't think a man was missing. The men were boiling with enthusiasm and afraid that the war would be over before they got to the firing line. I remember one man who was conspicuous on the march. He rode at the head of the column and got the bouquets the ladies threw at us. But in our first battle, he was conspicuous for his absence and stayed with the wagons. Our march to the army was an ovation. Nobody dreamed of the possibility of our failure and the last scene of the great drama at Appomattox. We made easy marches, and by the time we got to Wytheville, all of my depression of spirits had gone, and I was as lively as anybody. It took us 2 weeks to get to Richmond, where we spent a few days on the fairgrounds. We were then sent to a camp of instruction at Ashland, where we remained a short time, or until we, with a cavalry company from Amelia County, were ordered to Johnston's army in the Shenandoah. I well remember that we were in Ashland when news came to us that Joe Johnston on June 15th had retreated from Harper's Ferry to Winchester. To begin the war by abandoning such an outpost when there was no enemy near and no necessity for it was a shock for which we were not prepared, and it chilled our enthusiasm. I couldn't understand it, that was all, but my instinct told me at the time what was afterwards confirmed by reason and experience, that a great blunder had been committed. At Wytheville, on our third day's march to Richmond, we got the papers which informed us that the war had actually begun in a skirmish at Fairfax, where Captain Marr had been killed. We were greatly excited by the news of the affair. Our people had been reading about war and descriptions of battles by historians and poets from the days of Homer down, and were filled with enthusiasm for military glory. They had no experience in the hardships of military service, and knew nothing, had no conception of the suffering it brings to the homes of those who have left them. In all great wars, women and children are the chief sufferers. Our company joined the 1st Virginia Cavalry, commanded by Colonel Jeb Stuart in the Shenandoah Valley. At Richmond, Captain Jones, who stood high with those in authority, had procured sharp carbines for us. We considered this a great compliment, as arms were scarce in the Confederacy. We had been furnished with sabers before we left Abingdon, but the only real use I ever heard of their being put to was to hold a piece of meat over a fire for frying. I dragged one through the first year of the war, but when I became a commander, I discarded it. The saber and lance may have been very good weapons in the days of chivalry, and my suspicion is that the combats of the hero of Cervantes were more realistic and not such burlesques as they are supposed to be. But certainly the saber is of no use against gunpowder. Captain Jones also made requisition for uniforms, but when they arrived there was almost a mutiny. They were a sort of dun color and came from the penitentiary. The men piled them up in the camp, and all but Fount Beatty and myself refused to wear them. We joined Joe Johnston's army in the Shenandoah Valley at his headquarters in Winchester and rested there for a day. Then we went on to join Colonel Jeb Stewart's regiment at Bunker Hill, a village about 12 miles distant on the pike leading to Martinsburg, where Patterson's army was camped. We were incorporated into the 1st Virginia Cavalry, which Stewart had just organized, now on outpost to watch Patterson. I had never seen Stewart before, and the distance between us was so great that I never expected to rise to even an acquaintance with him. Stewart was a graduate of West Point, and as a lieutenant in Colonel Sumner's regiment, the 1st Cavalry, had won distinction and had been wounded in an Indian fight. At the beginning of the war, he was just 28 years old. His appearance, which included a reddish beard and a ruddy complexion, indicated a strong physique and great energy. In his work on the outposts, Stewart soon showed that he possessed the qualities of a great leader of cavalry. He never had an equal in such service. He discarded the old maxims and soon discovered that in the conditions of modern war, the chief functions of cavalry are to learn the designs and to watch and report the movements of the enemy. We rested a day in camp, and many of us wrote letters to our homes, describing the hospitable welcome we had met on our long march and our anxiety to meet the foe who was encamped a few miles away. On the following day, to our great delight, Captain Jones was ordered to take us on a scout towards Martinsburg. My first experience was near there, at Snodgrass Spring, where we came upon 2 soldiers who were out foraging. They ran across the field, but we overtook them. I got a canteen from one, the first I had ever seen, which I found very useful in the first battle I was in. It was a trophy which I prized highly. We got a good view of Patterson's army a mile or so away, and returned that evening to our bivouac, all in the highest of spirits. Nearly every man in the company wrote a letter to somebody the next day.
If you enjoyed today's video and would like to see more content like this, be sure to take a shot at the like button, subscribe, and ring that notification bell to stay up to date with all the latest BirdDogg content. If you'd like to support the channel, for a limited time there's exclusive Civil War Diaries merchandise available in the video link